Well, thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Had I known I'd be Mr. 47%, I would definitely have chosen a higher number, but sadly there's no way of foreseeing the future. In any case, it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak about some of the research that we're doing at the Oxford Martin School. We will try to understand how technology is reshaping labor markets in terms of job displacement, the type of jobs we think will disappear, but also in terms of the new jobs that we see emerge, because it's not only a one-sided story. The future of work has always been of great concern in the light of technology. In fact, it's probably a concern that is as old as work itself, goes at least back to the Roman Empire, where Emperor Vespasian worried about the introduction of machinery to bring columns to the capital, arguing that, how do you expect me to feel the populace? And here we are, some 2 millennia later, still concerned about roughly the same issues. So why should this time be any different? Well, the reason some people at least believe that this time is different is that computers provide potentially cheaper and cheaper substitutes for human workers. And as you can see here, nearly every new computer technology since the 1950s has been cheaper than its predecessors, with the possible exception of the iPad 2, which you can see is a bit of an outlier there. Skeptics to this view are obviously always keen to point out that, well, this has been going on for a couple of decades, and labor force participation has, if anything, increased, which is true. But you can also see that labor force participation peaked in the early 2000s and has slightly fallen, is projected to fall over the next decade. That has mainly to do with an aging workforce, and has mainly to do with a decline in women entering the workforce. But there's also seemingly something to do with the fact that if you look at the people that have actually fallen out of the labor force, it tends to be men between 25 and 55 that used to be employed in low-skilled jobs. And one thing is clear: computerization has had persuasive impacts on the world of work. Middle-income jobs have been disappearing across advanced economies. We've seen growth in high-skill, high-income jobs, and we've also seen some growth in low-skill, low-income job domains. And what these middle-income jobs have in common is that they are intensive in routine, rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated. But at the same time, we also see that computerization has increased the demand for skilled workers by creating new jobs and new industries, by creating new opportunities in professional services, where workers with cognitive abilities take advantage of computer technology. And what happens when one new skill job or one new tech job is created in a local economy is that the person goes out there and spends his money on services, goes to the hairdresser, goes shopping, takes a taxi, and so on and so forth. And on average, that creates around 5 new jobs in the local economy, leading to this sort of polarized pattern that we've been seeing. A continuous debate is obviously to what extent that sort of the disappearance of middle-income jobs in particular has to do with automation or offshoring. But the fact that the emerging economies today are not yielding nearly as many jobs in manufacturing as many advanced economies did in the past suggests that automation is at least one key driving force. Manufacturing employment peaked in the United States, Germany, United Kingdom, well below, above 30%. It has already peaked in China, India, and Brazil, below 20%. And while all of these trends have been going on for some time now, technology has not been standing still either. Computerization used to be confined to routine rule-based activities, but what we're seeing now is a new generation of big data-driven technologies which are also increasingly making non-routine tasks susceptible to automation. We now see algorithms doing translation work, they do document review, they do things like medical diagnostics, they even make decisions in financial services, in trading, and some also have applications in mobile robotics. The driverless car would not be a reality without the digitalization of 3D maps, for example. And beyond that, algorithms even have some comparative advantages to us when it comes to things like knowledge work and decision making. You can see here, this is a study of decision-making by Israeli judges. On the horizontal axis, you have the ordinal position during the day, and on the vertical one, you have the share of favorable decisions. And you can see in the morning, just after breakfast, we're in a jolly good mood, and we tend to make a good, fair share of favorable decisions. As energy levels decline during the day, we tend to get slightly grumpier and grumpier, and so falls our share of favorable decisions. And you see the same pattern after the morning snack and lunch. And this type of decision-making is something we can potentially get rid of by means of automation, which I think is potentially great news. So some people would then say, well, what the human worker still good for? Will the human worker go down the route of the horse, which was first displaced in artillery, then in transportation, then in agriculture, and is now largely reduced to ceremonial purposes and sports events? Well, the simple answer to that is obviously that humans are not horses. And we see 3 domains where human workers will still hold the comparative advantage in the future. And those relate to creativity, complex social interactions, and the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. When it comes to the perception and manipulation of irregular objects, picking up a glass is a fairly straightforward thing for most of us to do. But if you want a robot to do it, it's actually not as straightforward, because first of all, the glass is transparent, you can see through it, and the first thing you need to do is to identify the object and distinguish it from the background in order to pick it up. And when you pick it up, you also need to make sure that you apply the right amount of pressure when you do so, in order not to break it. And you can teach a robot to do that over and over again. But if you think about all the more diverse set of objects you have in your home, it's almost inconceivable to see that we have a general-purpose robot that will be able to do the work of a cleaner, for example. Distinguishing a pot that is dirty and needs to be clean from a pot that holds a plant is a very easy task for us to do, but it's not as straightforward for a robot. When it comes to complex social interactions, I think the state of the art is best described by the Turing test, where chatbots try to convince human judges of them being human. And last year, some would suggest that there was a breakthrough with one chatbot managing to convince 30% of judges of it being human. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old boy speaking English as his second language. And if you think about all the more complex social interactions you do in your jobs, where you try to persuade people, you negotiate, you manage teams, and so on and so forth, it's almost inconceivable that we will have an algorithm that will be able to substitute for us in those more complex sort of interactions. And the same is true with creativity. The reason we struggle with creativity is that we are very bad at defining it in the first place, and there tends to be disagreement amongst us what creativity actually is. And you can, for example, you can feed an algorithm 20 Beethoven symphonies and tell them these are the greatest of all times and write a new piece of music. But you're very unlikely to arrive at Schoenberg or Stravinsky by doing that. So when it comes to creativity, human workers will still also hold the comparative advantage we predict 10 or 20 years from now. So the key question then is obviously, how intensive are jobs actually in tasks that correspond to these bottlenecks to automation? Well, it turns out that actually quite a few jobs are not very intensive in such tasks. Roughly 47% of US jobs are susceptible to automation looking forward. And those are not confined to production or manufacturing. Actually, most of them fall into categories such as transportation, logistics, sales and services. So the expanding scope of automation is affecting a variety of jobs across the board. None of this obviously means that all of these jobs will be automated, right? It's simply a feasibility assessment of what is technologically possible, right? So decisions to automate depend on relative costs between capital and labor. When Nissan produces cars in Japan, they rely heavily on robotics. When they do the same thing in India, they rely heavily on cheap labor. This also depends on legislation and cultural factors as well. But if history tells us anything, most things that can be automated eventually will, and we should be very happy and grateful for that. The concern is not that the potential scope of automation is expanding. That should be taken as good news as such, because it means that the age of growth is not over. It means that there is a lot of potential in the digital revolution for increasing productivity in the future. The main concern is that productivity, or that wage growth, is no longer keeping track with productivity, meaning that workers are no longer benefiting from productivity gains in the same way, which is another way of saying that the labor share of income is falling. And a number of studies actually suggest that that has to do with technology. Another concern has to do with the growing regional divide. So in the United States, for example, we had income convergence across regions up until around 1980, and you see that has now come to halt. And one of the main reasons for that has to do with a divergence in skill and human capital levels. And what you can see on this slide here is that the cities, the places that have created new jobs in new industries, are different from the ones that are most susceptible to automation. And that means that we will have to manage a reallocation of workers across space to expanding cities. So despite of the promise of the digital revolution to make the concept of geography redundant, it has actually done the complete opposite. New jobs tend to cluster in initially skilled cities, and workers will have to move to where those jobs are. And if you look at the type of new jobs and type of new industries that are emerging, you can do so by comparing updates of statistical classifications. You see that 71 new industries have emerged since 2000, of which most are associated with digital industries. And you can see that the workers in those industries, on average, are much more likely to have a college degree, much more likely to have a STEM degree. They earn almost twice the US median wage. But there are also not that many jobs in those industries. Roughly 0.5% of the US workforce is employed in industries that have emerged since the turn of the century. And if you compare this to past technological revolutions, McKinsey did a little study where they looked at the 3 largest companies in Detroit versus Silicon Valley, and found that they yield often the same in terms of revenues, but Silicon Valley does so with about 1/10 of the workers. And that is long before Detroit's peak. And you can obviously see that the General Motors and the Fords and so on employ a lot more workers than the WhatsApps and the Instagrams and the Facebook of these worlds. And that means that technology sectors are not yielding the same amount of jobs as they once did. Most people are not employed in tech. So where does all the jobs come from? Well, most of them come from services. I mean, if you look across the OECD, even high-tech manufacturing has declined. Where we see the expansion come from is personal and professional services. And the promise of the forthcoming digital revolution is actually its promise of transforming those services that have, in many cases, been subject to low productivity over the past couple of decades. So in many ways, the fourth industrial revolution is actually a de-industrial revolution, because it promises to do to services what the first industrial revolution did to manufacturing. And a concern that many see associated with that is that, well, what is going to happen to all of those workers? Keynes predicted back in the 1930s widespread technological unemployment on the basis that most jobs in manufacturing, most jobs in mining, most jobs in agriculture could be automated. And he was right, but he failed to foresee the rise of the service economy. And in the same way, we are likely to fail to foresee what is coming ahead. But the lesson from the past is that technological unemployment is not necessarily the main concern. The concern is to make sure that most people actually benefit from that growth and from the deindustrial revolution. Thanks very much.